Hey everyone, Akawaha Boy Rocks here. It is a rainy Thunderegg Thursday in north central Florida, and I want to do a little bit different kind of shop video and talk about some of the problems cutting Thundereggs. Now, lots of people have videos about their clamp, their, whatever it is that they use to cut Thundereggs well. You've seen some of my setup. We're going to look at that again in brief, but there's still some issues I need to work out, so I'm going to try and work on that this evening. You've seen my drop saw before, but just real quick, I use these two clamps. I've got that piece of plywood in there with different holes in it so I can move it back and forth, and some other little blocks and things I use sometimes. The saw has a little side step here so that I can move the blade back and forth, and that helps me get a pretty good cut on even some goofy Thundereggs like this. So to me that is a beautiful Thunderegg, but I don't know how you'd cut it on any other type of setup other than something like this. But there's still some problems, and you need a decent sized egg to really be able to work well in. Now these are some of the eggs I cut in a recent video on the trim saw. I'll cut in some footage of that right about here. And I've already sanded on these quite a lot, much more time than I usually would spend on an egg this size on 60 grit. And you can see there's still lots and lots of saw marks. That's because as you go through holding the egg by hand, you wiggle, your hands wiggle just a little bit, and that blade's gonna eat up the face of that egg. So that's not a great way to do it. You definitely want it clamped. So when you clamp something in a normal saw with the clamp on the side, I did this in my 18-inch Great Western, you get something like this, because you have to clamp more of the egg on one side than the other. You kind of have to put the middle of the egg in the clamp, then you can't cut right down the middle. That's an awful nice polka dot agate mine. I think they call it the Canyon Rim bed. Nice egg, but it's way too big for my drop saw. Didn't have the drop saw when I cut it, and it's way off center. So you might think, you got an egg this size, cut it by hand on the trim saw, you end up with this. Clamp it, and clamp on the auto feed trim saw, you're going to end up with something off center like that. So got to come up with a way to do this where I can clamp it, but it's going to not be off center. And with the type of clamp, using two clamps like the drop saw has, a lot of times you'll get squeezing because it'll press from the two sides. See how I've got that burr there at the end of the cut? That's because when I cut this, it was squeezing in from either side, but I've got it held up top to bottom the way it was on the saw, and then it gets towards the end of the cut and that last piece breaks and it pushes in on the blade and binds it up, and it won't cut all the way through. And so that's as big a problem as anything else and adds to your sanding time. So we're going to go over to the 10-inch auto feed trim saw, crown lapidary trim saw, and look at it. So here's my 10-inch crown lapidary, very dirty trim saw. So you'll see the clamp only clamps from one side. It does move in and out, but I still can't cut a Thunderegg centered. So what I'm about to do is make a plywood mock-up. The idea will be to take a couple of pieces of this plywood, where the plywood mounts in the clamp. I'm going to put some carriage bolts and wing nuts on it, and then the idea is the saw will cut through the plywood. The first egg I cut through the plywood at the same time as the egg. The egg will be clamped from both sides, and it should work out okay. Now, the issue that's going to cause is, since the plywood's going to go over the top of the egg, the guard will have to be out of the way, and oil's just going to go all over the place. But if this works as a clamp, I can build a top out of some sort of plexiglass like this, and then there'll be room for the clamp in there and keep the oil contained. So I'm going to go in the garage to my woodworking tools and try and rough something out with this plywood, and then if I like it, I can build it out of metal or something if I want to down the road. Okay, it's not going to focus on it down there, but there is my Thunderegg clamped in my makeshift mock-up clamp, proof of concept. So the idea is the saw should slice through that wood no trouble, and hopefully the egg will be clamped appropriately from both sides. I've got some issues with the geometry of where I put my carriage bolts in this, and I need a couple more through the top here, actually holding the clamp apart instead of tight. So, but I think it's in there. I think it's going to cut okay, so I'm going to give it a try. Okay, I am through the rock. I've cut right through the wood on each side. That'll make it easier next time to center the stone with the blade. And now it's time to get it out of there and see what it looks like. Neither side of the rock fell away, so I think I'm still clamped securely in there. Alright, here are 2 Thundereggs I just cut on my now very oily clamp. I'll come back and talk about it in a minute. But it did very well as far as keeping both halves clamped. It didn't squeeze them together. Neither one fell away when the blade passed through the cut. This one pretty well a dud, but that's a great kind to use for an experiment. And you do still have to actually line the egg up in order for the clamp to help you. So I failed on that with this egg, but that's fine. It proved that it holds the egg. I pretty much still went through more or less the thickest part of the egg. Well then, once I did that, I had the cut through the wood to line the egg up with. Don't worry too much about the cut's not 90 degrees. I had done some adjustments on the saw and didn't get it quite true yet. But for Thundereggs, you're just cutting through them, so it's not as big a deal. So then I cut this one. I lined it up on the cut through the wood, so you can see it's much more in the center, and I had a much nicer egg too. Don't know where these eggs were from. They were in a mix box I bought, so not going to focus on them too much. Let's slide this oily mess over here. So what worked well and what didn't? The placement of the bolts wasn't perfect. This one kind of tried to interfere with the clamp on the saw, but it wasn't too bad. I definitely need in this area, and maybe down here as well, need to put a carriage bolt through with the wing nuts on the inside so that it holds the wood apart. Because when I go to clamp this thing, it tends to want to pinch it and won't hold it very well. It needs to be flush like this in the vise for the vise to actually hold it still. So I need to make some modifications to this mock-up, and I'll be trying it again in another video probably, not right now. I don't have the parts on hand to do it with. But I'm going to try the mock-up a few more times, and then I'm thinking maybe some hard plastic, some sheet plastic possibly, might be a good material to make something more permanent out of. It'll still be a tiny bit flexible, but the oil will wipe off of it and everything much better. All right, hope you enjoyed looking at my mock-up Thunderegg clamp to try and hold the smaller ones true in the trim saw. This got a nice cut out of that thing, nice and centered, no deep saw marks. I think I'm going to like using a clamp like that rather than trying to run these smaller eggs through the trim saw by hand. All right, well, hope you enjoyed. See you next Thunderegg Thursday.